Hello, this is Tony Nichols, co-founder and Chief Technology Officer of Great Ideas. This video is part of our training on enterprise architecture with examples using .NET Blazor, Azure, and Great Ideas Trellis Spark. And the focus of this video is an introduction into governance within the context of enterprise architecture. So our focus in this video is going to be on how do we maximize business value and minimize risk through the efficient use of development operations. And we're going to try and answer a few different questions here. Initially, why do we need governance in the first place? What does effective governance look like? How do we structure governance within an organization? And we're also going to briefly discuss the difference between governance and project management. And then finally, we'll look at how do we adopt an agile approach to development operations. As we get further and further into the course, we're going to be doing a set of deep dive videos on each of these topics. So the first question we need to ask is, why do we need governance in the first place? An organization is a living thing. It exists in the real world, and the real world is constantly changing around us. So our organizations also need to be constantly evolving, growing, adapting to that changing environment. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that as this constant change, as this constant series of opportunities and risks emerge, that we have a way of bringing all of those things into focus, into prioritizing them, into making sure that we're continuously minimizing the organizational risk and at the same time generating as much value as possible. Examples of things that are changing that we need to be cognizant of is new products and services. If you think about the last couple of years and how COVID pandemic has impacted business and IT operations, there are lots of new products and services that have emerged and lots of changes to existing products and services that already were actually being provided by organizations. So when we talk to executives, one of the key things that they're focused on essentially is always growing market share. If you talk to a business leader, they're always looking, well, how do I get more share here? How do I develop a new product there? How do I make my organization, whatever that organization is, have a greater impact in the market in which it participates? And at the same time as doing that, at the same time as growing that market share and value, they also want to look at how do they optimize their existing operations. And sometimes this is refining business processes. It may be eliminating risks in the business. We're constantly looking for ways to deliver value more efficiently, more effectively, and at the same time minimizing the organizational risks as we go through that process. Another thing that we talk to C-suite executives about all the time, and this is the ideas of mergers, acquisitions, and divestments. So our organization changes whenever we merge two organizations, or we acquire an organization, or we divest an organization. And that has an impact on IT, on DevOps, and we need to make sure that we're making best use of the IT resources to support those big picture M&A and divestment decisions. Finally, but not least, is regulatory changes. So if the government changes a rule, or if something else changes in the way that products go to market, and we need to take into account new changes, new reporting requirements, we need to be also sensitive, primarily from a risk basis. The regulations have changed, and what impact does that have on my business, and how is that then reflected in my IT systems? So given that we've got this endless series of opportunities and risks, okay, if you look at the needs are endless, they're infinite, okay? But whenever we talk to an organization, IT resources always seem to be limited and they're overstretched. I've never been in an organization where the IT team weren't working 10%, 15% overtime, right? I mean, for some reason, whenever you go and talk to an IT organization, there aren't people sat around doing nothing for half the day. Those people are always 110% focused on keeping the lights on, maintaining their existing applications, and maybe they have some time on the side to build or evolve or make changes in new applications, and frequently those new applications are outsourced to third-party suppliers. So you always see this issue that there's a higher need than there is available resources to fulfill that need. So the question that we really need to address as a business is, how do we decide which opportunities or risks need to be addressed first? And then how do we make sure that those opportunities that we've identified are efficiently implemented within the organization and rolled out to deliver the value? Or if we've identified a new organizational risk, how do we make sure that that risk is eliminated or mitigated as quickly and efficiently as possible? So what does effective governance look like? As we said on the other slide, the only constant in our organization is change. It's a living, growing, evolving entity, and it exists inside a world and a market that is also constantly growing and evolving and changing. And so what this means is that our priorities as an organization are continuously going to change. New priorities will emerge, the relative issues that we're trying to deal with from an opportunity and risk perspective, something that may have seen a huge risk last week is now only a moderate risk, or maybe isn't even a risk at all now, or an opportunity that we were looking at for a new product has now emerged into a high priority change. If you think about the step change that we saw in COVID, a whole bunch of things that maybe were low on people's priority list from a risk or an opportunity perspective immediately jumped to the top of the list because the way businesses had to go to market was very, very different. So we're looking at a constant changing environment where the priorities of the opportunities and risks are constantly changing. And within that constantly changing environment, we want to make sure that we're always going to be maximizing value delivery to the business and minimizing the organizational risks that the business is facing. So what we're looking for is a very smooth iterative process. We can't say that risks and opportunities only arise on the first Monday of each month, all right? So we need to be able to identify these opportunities and risks as they arise and make sure that we add them into something that we commonly term a backlog as an item. So we take an opportunity or a risk and we add it to a backlog, which is a list of opportunities and risks, and we call that a backlog item within the context of enterprise architecture and within the context of the rest of this course. So what we want to be able to do is put these things into our backlog as backlog items, and then what we need to be able to do is evaluate and prioritize each of those items in the backlog. The objective being to be able to bundle a set of backlog items into a change cycle that we're going to implement within that change cycle. And then we want to roll out those changes to the organization to make sure that we're realizing the value and reducing the risk. And there's a whole bunch of things that are going on here. First of all, we want our change cycles to be relatively short so that we can deliver changes to the business faster, which means that we can see those business benefits, that value addition, that risk mitigation. We want to be able to do this on a relatively fast cycle. We also need to make sure that if we're going to go through and evaluate and prioritize these backlog items, that we need to be able to evaluate any dependencies between backlog items. We need some assessment of value, costs, risks, and we need that to in some way be reliable and repeatable. Right? If we're always looking at every item and we've got no idea what's it going to cost, what value is it going to deliver, what risks is it going to mitigate, what risks is it going to introduce, then how do we make the decisions around which backlog items are going to be prioritized for each of the individual change cycles? So we talked about this smooth iterative process that's doing this on a continuous basis, but sometimes there are emergencies. We do need also an emergency bypass mechanism where if a critical risk emerges, that we can break the process for a moment and we can prioritize this new risk or this new opportunity right at the top of the cycle and say, you know what, stop what you're doing, get this done now. So when we're doing that, then we need a process for identifying a criteria for identifying that this is an emergency bypass situation. We need a way of halting those elements of the implementation chain that are going to actually get that change made. And then as that change is made and deployed to the business, we then need a way of resuming back into our smooth iterative process again. And a point to make about this emergency bypass mechanism, it is an emergency. It's supposed to be once in a blue moon, right? So if everything is going through the emergency bypass mechanism, then what was the point of having the smooth iterative process? So one of the things that we want to be really clear around the criteria for invoking an emergency is it has to be implemented at the highest levels of governance, and it then has to flow through. And we need to make sure that there are good criteria guiding that process from start to finish. So all that said, how do we structure governance within an organization? So first and foremost, most of the basic processes and concepts related to governance are essentially similar from organization to organization. So it doesn't really matter if you're in the healthcare industry or the finance industry. That really doesn't impact what the governance processes are and the sorts of ideas that we need to bring into play. Essentially, what we're trying to do in governance is create a strategic decision-making process. And within the governance structure, that decision-making body is generally referred to or called a governance steering group. Now, when you look at organization governance steering groups, you tend to notice that there is a hierarchy. At the highest levels of the organization, there will be a steering group that's making decisions and setting the direction of the organization as a whole. And then at each of the organizational levels below that, you may also have additional governance steering groups that take direction from the next higher up level and then figure out how does this guidance, how does this direction apply in my particular organizational unit. So one thing to note about governance steering groups is that they tend to be hierarchic and they reflect the structure of the organization, and the composition of the steering group, again, also reflects essentially the decision makers at each level of the organization. Now, the decision-making criteria in each of those levels may be slightly different. So one thing that does need to be tweaked and customized within the different steering group levels is the criteria upon which that particular steering group is going to make the prioritization of the backlog items. That's one area where criteria will change from group to group to group. The other thing that we need to sort of like think about is the frequency of the meetings that happen in each of these layers of governance steering groups. The lowest layer, when we actually get to project execution, tends to be the one that meets most frequently. And then as we go up layers above that, then the frequency tends to decrease. So if we're going to have, say, a project implementation frequency of a week, then within an organizational unit that houses that project team, we might be meeting once a month, and then the next level up maybe once a quarter, and then the next level up maybe once a year. So one thing to consider as you understand the hierarchy of your organization and where you need to put these governance steering groups is how frequently are they going to meet. And again, this is really all around the length of the change cycles. So big decisions reflecting the structure of an organization as a whole, probably a year, maybe an appropriate length of time. For a very large organization, maybe it's 3 years, 5 years. Okay, so we need to make sure that the length of the change cycles is appropriate to the level of the steering group. And ultimately, the objective is to get down to project execution where we want change cycles measured in 1 to 4 weeks. So we talked about the idea of levels, and the highest levels of the steering groups are essentially a strategic business-led function. So the business is figuring out what are the opportunities and risks it's currently needing to address. And then it does need input from the IT teams, from the DevOps, around what are the dependencies that we need to achieve those particular things, what's the effort, what are the costs, what are the risks that are being introduced by doing this in a particular way. And the output from these higher levels of a steering group is essentially consensus on a relative set of backlog item priorities, so that we can say that when I go into the next change cycle, the backlog items that I need to pass down to the next lower level group are these 10 items out of this backlog of 100 items. And that happens all the way down to the lowest level where you actually have the tactical execution of the backlog items themselves. So we've introduced two different sort of ideas here, and within the context of our enterprise architecture, they're both getting lumbered under this title of governance. So governance in its purest form is this strategic decision-making process that exists at some level of the organization. And essentially what governance is doing is setting the direction of the organization as a whole with an emphasis on minimizing the organizational risk and then maximizing any return on investment on IT spend. So essentially governance is this strategic process. And the point of governance is to identify, as we've said, the risks and opportunities, to prioritize those risks and opportunities into a set of backlog items that are passed down into lower level governance groups, so that essentially the decisions made at the top of the organization flow through as guidance into each of its subordinate organizational units to a point where we're actually making a decision and saying, well, we're going to build this solution, we're going to delete this solution, we're going to set up these servers. And then we have almost a step change. After we've gone through the strategic decision making, now we're going to be talking tactical implementation of those decisions. And that's essentially where project management comes in. So at this point, we're not really trying to make decisions on what do we do next. We're actually executing on those decisions. And it's a step change, really, in how we're managing and how we're looking at what's going on. So all of the stuff that happens in governance is let's get a set of backlog items. Let's figure out which backlog items we need to give to the next lower team. Project management is the step change. It's tactical, it's implementation, it's execution. So typically, our project management team is going to be based around a cross-functional, self-organizing team. So what do we mean by that? Cross-functional in the sense that when I give the backlog item to the project team, I'm not going to tell them exactly what I want doing. I'm not going to be giving them essentially a design. I'm not going to be giving them a 100-page requirement document. I'm going to be saying to that implementation team, I need this functionality. Can you please go away with this, figure out what that really means and how we can execute that efficiently, maybe come back with a couple of options so that I understand what I'm doing here, and then make sure that one of those options actually gets executed and implemented, and then it needs to be rolled out, and my business needs to be ready to actually adopt it. So when you think about that, there's actually quite a lot of stuff going on in this implementation phase. We've got some sort of business analysis happening in terms of refinement of requirement and selecting particular implementation options. We've certainly got a whole bunch of IT implementing a new change to the application stack potentially, or creating new data structures. Potentially we've got a whole bunch of operations stuff happening, provisioning new servers, new storage, etc. And then we've got some QA happening, and then we've got some business change management. The business themselves have to be ready to make changes to processes and actually adopt what's going on. So you can imagine, right, there's a lot of stuff going on in these cross-functional teams. And largely they're self-organizing in the sense that we give them at the start of the cycle, here is a bunch of backlog items that we want you to work on, figure out what's the most efficient way of doing that. So we're not trying to produce a Gantt chart at the start of the cycle. We're saying, here is a list of things we need doing. Can you look at that list, figure out what's the most efficient way to execute the list? So The team itself is just taking this list of backlog items, it's got some high level requirements, and then we're recognizing that that cross-functional IT team is actually a bunch of very talented people. Right? These people are able to work from these high level requirements and produce the solutions that we need. They're highly trained, they're experienced, they know the environment and how we want things built. We don't need to tell them, write this line of code here, then write that line of code there, and then write this line of code here. Right? We didn't employ these people because they couldn't do this stuff. We employed them because they could. So one thing that we tend to see when we look at governance structures is that people want to over-specify, provide almost the implementation details as they pass the information to the project management team. And essentially at that point, you've got overreach of the governance function. They've gone too far. They've done too much. Essentially what we're trying to find is let's make sure that we're maximizing the effectiveness of our DevOps team and make sure that we're also leveraging fully that team's experience and knowledge so that we're not doing that for them in the governance, because if we constrain the DevOps team too much, then we might not get what really is the best solution to our problem. We need to really rely on our DevOps team in project management to ensure that we get the optimum implementation. So all that being said, why is it so hard? The issue is, first and foremost, a lot of organizations don't really have a good governance structure. And one of the foundations of having that governance structure is a well-defined enterprise architecture. You need some way of structuring the business needs. You need some way of structuring your decision-making criteria. So one of the things that we find in terms of organizations that do this well is that they have got an enterprise architecture. So if you think about the business architecture, that helps us to understand the organization's value chains, its business processes, the scenarios, the use cases. What is the business doing? What does the business need? How is the business adding value? Where are the risks in how the value is being added? So understanding the business architecture helps us to generate a consensus and common understanding of those business needs, not only within the business organization, but also within the IT organization. So the more that the IT department understands about what the business is trying to do and how the business is trying to do it, the better the IT organization can support those business functions. So understanding now that we have the business needs clearly identified and consensus on what those needs and priorities are, now we can start to layer over that the governance criteria that are going to guide the decision making of the steering groups. But those governance criteria also flow down into our project management because that is still the lowest level of our governance framework in enterprise architecture. So as well as having criteria that guide the decision making at a strategic level, those governance criteria also flow into our project management. So when our teams are taking the high level requirements from the backlog items given to them by the steering group, they are able to say, well, okay, based on what the steering group has given me in this backlog item, based on my understanding of what the business is doing, and based on this is the criteria that the business is telling me is good versus bad, now I can come up with some implementation options to actually figure out how am I going to deliver this change within the organization. So the other thing a really good enterprise architecture is going to do for us is it's going to present best practice around the organization. So at the business architecture level, we will see in the business processes and the value chains, what are the best practices from a business perspective within the organization? And then how are those best practices from the business perspective translated into IT, into changes in how the data architecture or the application architecture or the infrastructure architecture work. So one of the things that we want to do is make sure that our enterprise architecture is presenting here are the best practices both from a business perspective, from a technology perspective, from an applications perspective, and then set a set of standards and procedures for implementation and execution at all levels, from the organizational business, here is how we're going to do this, through to here is how I'm going to set up and secure a server, here is how I'm going to build a new application service, here is how I'm going to create and transfer data between services. And what this enables us to do at the end of the day is build a highly flexible and agile IT team that understands and therefore can properly support the organization. So all that being said, is there a standard DevOps methodology? And the answer is unfortunately not really. The issue is that there are a whole bunch of books and tool sets and vendor-specific approaches to DevOps methodology, but one isn't necessarily any better than the other. Okay, personally, I like the Azure DevOps approach and essentially using their agile project management tools within the Azure framework. I think that gives a really cool integration of both understanding the strategic governance and backlog items into project management and being able to link that into code changes in repos and actually be able to tie the execution tasks together and produce nice reports. But that's a personal thing, right? There are lots of different DevOps methodologies and tool sets available in the world, and you need to basically pick something that's appropriate for the IT department and business organizational structures that you're actually working with. Things to bear in mind here is that you may even pick two different tools or two different methods. Okay, so remember, there is a big difference between the strategic decision making that you're going to use in the steering group. So maybe you just end up with a bunch of processes and a set of meetings, some Word documents, and maybe an Excel spreadsheet or some sort of spreadsheet that just has your backlog list on it. And for the strategic decision making at the steering group, that set of minutes and that spreadsheet might be all you decide you need. When you get down to tactical planning at the project management level, then maybe you want to adopt one of the DevOps tool sets. The Azure platform is great for this, but there are many, many others. I mean, pick which platform you're on, pick which tools that you want to use, and then just get something that your team can actually focus around. Within the more detailed deep dive videos, we're going to be looking at Azure DevOps as a strategic decision-making toolset and also a tactical planning toolset in detail. But as I say, that's just how we chose to implement stuff in Great Ideas. You may end up with a different methodology and a different supporting toolset, and that's fine. As long as you've got something in place, built on a foundation of a solid enterprise architecture, you're in a good place.
To learn more about Great Ideas products and solutions, visit greatideas.com. That's great ideas with a Z.com. Thanks.